Imagine a world where the bloodiest regimes in history weren't driven by religious fervor, but by a fanatical rejection of faith altogether. Where the greatest sources of violence and oppression weren't sparked by clashes between believers, but by those who sought to eradicate religion entirely. This may sound like a radical idea, but the historical evidence tells a surprising story, one that challenges the assumption that religion is the primary cause of humanity's darkest conflicts. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into the numbers and historical records to examine the true sources of the world's deadliest conflicts. While wars fought in the name of religion have certainly left deep scars, the data shows the secular ideologies like communism and fascism were responsible for far more deaths and destruction in the 20th century alone. So if religion isn't the primary driver of violence, what is? Join us as we explore the complex relationship between faith, politics, and the darkest chapters of human history, and uncover a surprising truth that may challenge everything you thought you knew. The Muslim Conquests, 7th and 8th centuries AD. The early Islamic conquests swept across vast regions with remarkable speed, transforming the political and religious landscape of the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe. These conquests, under leaders like Caliph Abu Bakr, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Uthman, and Ali, were not just about spreading Islam, but about asserting dominance over the crumbling Byzantine and Sassanid empires. Imagine the chaos and terror of the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD, where the Byzantine army, once the dominant power in the region, faced the swift and coordinated cavalry of the Muslim forces. Dust rose in the air, the clanging of swords echoed across the battlefield, and cries of the wounded filled the plains. This pivotal battle, commanded by Khalid ibn al-Walid on the Muslim side, shattered Byzantine control of the Levant and marked the beginning of a new era in the region. One of the most significant events was the capture of Jerusalem in 637 AD. Unlike the devastation of Yarmouk, Jerusalem surrendered peaceably after a long siege. Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab personally entered the city and famously showed respect for its diverse religious communities, an act remembered for its diplomacy. Historian Karen Armstrong notes in Jerusalem, One City, Three Faiths, Umar's entry into Jerusalem demonstrated an Islamic respect for other monotheistic faiths, though it was part of a larger, often violent campaign of expansion. However, not all cities fared as peaceably as Jerusalem. From Persia to North Africa, cities that resisted were often met with brutality. Historians estimate between 9 and 11 million people died during the early Muslim conquests, either in battle or from the resulting displacement and hardship. Entire populations were displaced or forced to convert, and the rapid expansion of the Islamic Empire was fueled by a mix of religious zeal and strategic control of vital trade routes. As historian Hugh explains in The Great Arab Conquests, the conquests were driven by both the desire to spread Islam and the pragmatic need to secure key territories. The combination of faith and political ambition made the early Islamic armies nearly unstoppable. This blend of motives mirrors many religious conflicts throughout history where political power and faith became inseparable. But what drove the Islamic forces to expand so quickly? Was it purely religious, or was there a deeper political strategy at play? As we explore the following conflicts, we'll see that religion is rarely the sole cause of violence. It often serves as a catalyst for deeper political and economic ambitions. Now this takes us to the Crusades, which took place in 1096 to 1291 AD. Centuries later, European Christians launched the Crusades in response to the Muslim control of the Holy Land, sparking one of the most notorious series of religious wars in history. The First Crusade, in 1096 to 1099, is often remembered for its brutality, especially the Siege of Jerusalem, where crusaders massacred thousands of Muslims and Jews. The slaughter of the Jews during the First Crusade was largely motivated by religious zeal and a misdirected belief that Jews, as non-Christian, were also enemies of Christendom. Many crusaders viewed Jews as Christ killers due to medieval Christian interpretations, and this sentiment often resulted in violence towards Jewish communities. In the context of the First Crusade, Crusaders saw their mission as purging Jerusalem and other holy sites of all non-Christian, which also included the Jews. Picture the scene. The city's walls have fallen, and the streets are filled with the screams of the dying. Eyewitnesses wrote, "In the temple and the porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins." The violence was shocking, even by medieval standards. Between 1 and 3 million people are estimated to have died during the Crusades, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in religious history. But while the Crusaders were driven by religious fervor, they were also about political and financial gain. Jonathan Riley Smith, a leading historian on the Crusades, argues that the Crusades were deeply political, driven by the ambitions of European monarchs and knights seeking to expand their influence in the Middle East. Indeed, many Crusaders were motivated as much by the promise of land and wealth as by their faith. For them, the Holy Land was not just a spiritual goal, it was a material one. Leaders like Pope Urban II, who launched the First Crusade in 1095, recognized the potential for consolidating power and influence. The Crusades also opened up valuable trade routes to the east, making them not just a religious war, but also an economic enterprise. As we explore the Crusades further, it becomes clear that religion, politics, and economics were inextricably linked. The legacy of the Crusades continues to shape relations between the Christian and Muslim world to this day, illustrating the long-lasting impact of religious conflicts on global history. But why did so many ordinary people join the Crusades, risking their lives in brutal battles far from home? Were they truly motivated by faith, or were there other factors at play? The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. By the 17th century, Europe was torn apart by one of its deadliest and most complex conflicts, the 30 Years' War. What began as a religious struggle between Protestant and Catholic states within the Holy Roman Empire soon evolved into a broader political conflict involving nearly every major European power. The death toll was staggering, with estimates ranging between 4 to 8 million people, most of them dying from famine and disease rather than battle. The war's religious nature was clear at the outset. Catholic forces led by the Habsburgs under Ferdinand II sought to suppress Protestantism, while the Protestant states, including those led by Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, fought for their right to practice their faith. But as the war dragged on, religion took a backseat to political power. France, a Catholic nation, even sided with Protestant forces to weaken the Habsburgs, demonstrating how political ambitions often overshadowed religious ones. Historian Peter Wilson in The 30 Years' War, Europe's Tragedy, explains that the war began as a conflict over religion, but quickly evolved into a struggle for dominance in Europe. The devastation it caused was immense, with entire regions laid waste by mercenary armies and civilians caught in the crossfire. The human cost was appalling. Towns were razed, and the countryside was ravaged by roving bands of soldiers. Famine and plague spread across Europe, leaving behind a continent scarred by one of the most destructive wars in its history. Yet for all the devastation, the 30 Years' War helped reshape Europe's political landscape, paving the way for the modern nation-state system. How did a war that began over religious differences turn into one of Europe's deadliest power struggles? And what lessons can we learn from the way politics and faith collided during this event? As we delve deeper into these religious wars, the complex motivations behind them become even more clear. The French Wars of Religion, 1562 to 1598. The French wars of religion tore the country apart, pitting Catholics against Protestants, called the Huguenots, in a brutal conflict that claimed between 2 to 4 million lives. The tension reached its bloody peak on the night of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, when the thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris and across France. Imagine the scene in Paris, the sound of church bells signaling the start of the massacre, the screams of the Huguenots as they were dragged from their homes, and the streets running red with blood. One survivor wrote, "It was as if all of Paris had turned into a battlefield. The stench of death was everywhere, and no one knew if they would survive the night." Historian Mac P. Holt argues that while these wars were driven by deep religious convictions, they were also about power. Control of the French throne was at stake, and religion became the dividing line in this political struggle. The war wasn't just about faith, it was about who would rule France in the midst of a divided society. But what was it like to live through this conflict? How did ordinary French people navigate a world where neighbors turned against each other, driven by faith and fear? And that brings us to the Inquisition, which took place between the 12th and 19th centuries. The Inquisition, especially the infamous Spanish Inquisition, stands as one of history's darkest chapters of religious oppression. Thousands were executed for heresy, with death tolls estimated between 30,000 to 300,000. The victims were often Jews, Muslims, and Protestants, persecuted for their beliefs or simply accused by envious neighbors seeking revenge. Picture the terror of a suspected heretic brought before the Inquisition's tribunal, the cold stone walls of the courtroom, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows, and the quiet tension as the accused awaited their sentence. Torture was a common method of extracting confessions. One account describes the screams of prisoners echoing through the dungeons as they endured the rack, water torture, and even more unspeakable horrors. Historian Henry Kamen explains that the Inquisition was not only about religious orthodoxy. It was a tool of the state used by monarchs to exert control over their subjects. The fear it generated ensured loyalty to both the church and the crown, creating a climate of fear that lasted for centuries. What made the Inquisition so terrifying was its reach. No one was safe from accusation. But how did ordinary people live in constant fear of being denounced? Could a simple misunderstanding or grudge end their lives? The Alba Jensen Crusade, 1209 to 1229. The Albigensian Crusade, launched by Pope Innocent III to eradicate the Cathar heresy in southern France, claimed the lives of between 200,000 and 1 million people. This brutal campaign saw entire cities destroyed, and one of its most infamous moments occurred during the massacre of Bessieres in 1209. As the Crusaders stormed the city, they slaughtered everyone in sight, men, women, and children. According to one chronicler, the streets flowed with blood as thousands fell beneath the swords of the Crusaders. In a chilling declaration, the papal legate reportedly said, "Kill them all, God will know his own," encapsulating the extreme zealotry of the time. Historian Malcolm Barber notes that the Albigensian Crusade was as much about political control as it was about religious purification. The Catholic Church saw the Cathars as a threat not only to their orthodoxy, but also to its authority in southern France. The massacre demonstrated how religion could be wielded as a justification for extreme violence in the pursuit of both spiritual and temporal power. How did the Cathars, ordinary men and women, survive in a world where their faith made them targets of one of history's bloodiest religious purges? The Reconquista, from the 8th to the 15th centuries. The Reconquista was a centuries-long series of military campaigns by Christian kingdoms to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. Over the course of 700 years, the conflict claimed between 7 and 10 million lives, culminating in 1492 with the fall of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. After the Christian victory, the streets of Granada echoed with the laments of Muslim population. Forced to convert to Christianity or face exile, many fled their homes. The smell of smoke filled the air as precious manuscripts, treasures of Islamic scholarship, were burned in public squares. One witness wrote, "The flames consumed our past, and with it our hope for the future." The Reconquista also led to the expulsion of Jews from Spain, or their forced conversion under threat of death. The period saw the rise of the Spanish Inquisition, which targeted religious minorities and those suspected of secretly practicing their faith, as we've discussed. What was it like for the Muslim and Jewish communities who had lived in Spain for centuries, only to be suddenly cast out of their homeland? How did they survive the dramatic upheaval? The Jewish-Roman Wars, 66 through 135. The Jewish-Roman Wars, which included the First Jewish Revolt, the Quitos War, and the Bar Kokhba Revolt, resulted in the deaths of between 350,000 to 1 million people. The First Jewish Revolt, culminating in the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. For the Jews and the first century church in Jerusalem, this was like a towering lighthouse crumbling during a storm, an event that symbolized the collapse of many of the old ways of guiding and orienting their faith. For the early Jewish followers of Christ, the temple was still a focal point of their religious identity, but its destruction marked a seismic shift. Just as sailors would have to rely on new navigational tools after the loss of a lighthouse, the early church had to reorient itself away from temple-centered worship toward a more decentralized, spiritual community built on faith in the Messiah and God's plan for the reconciliation of the world which he revealed. Josephus, a Jewish historian who lived through the revolt, provides a chilling description of the siege of Jerusalem. The streets were filled with the dead, and the blood flowed through the city. Starvation ravaged the population as Roman forces led by future Emperor Titus laid waste to the city. One survivor wrote, "Those who lived envied the dead, for they had escaped the torment of hunger and despair." These wars were about more than just religious freedom for the Jews. They were also about Jewish resistance to Roman occupation and the fight for their independence. However, the Romans saw these revolts and their temple as a threat to their imperial control, leading to a brutal and decisive response. How did the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem reshape Jewish identity and faith? What was it like for the Jewish people to live through such profound loss? The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864 AD. The Taiping Rebellion, led by Hong X, who claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ, ranks as one of the deadliest conflicts in history, with an estimated death toll of 20 to 30 million people. Hong sought to establish a Christian-inspired heavenly kingdom in China, leading to a devastating civil war that tore the country apart. Jonathan Spence, in God's Chinese Son, describes the fanaticism that gripped Hong's followers. They believed they were fighting not only for a new China, but for the kingdom of heaven itself. The rebellion was marked by extreme violence, including the massacre of civilians as both sides struggled for control. The Taiping Rebellion wasn't just a religious conflict, it was also about social and political revolution. Hong's vision for China clashed violently with the traditional Confucian order, leading to one of the most destructive civil wars in the history of the world. What drove Hong to declare himself the brother of Christ and launch a war that would reshape China? How did his religious vision spiral into such catastrophic violence? The Partition of India in 1947. The partition of British India into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan led to one of the bloodiest upheavals of the 20th century, with an estimated death toll of 200,000 to 2 million people. Religious identity played a central role as Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs clashed during the chaotic forced migrations. Imagine the terror and confusion as entire families were uprooted from their homes, traveling across newly drawn borders in search of safety. Trains packed with refugees became targets for mass killing. One survivor recalled, "We heard the cries of those being slaughtered as our train passed through the dark night, and we feared that we would be next." As historian Yasmin Khan explains, the violence of partition was not just about religion, it was also about the political and territorial ambitions of the new states. The legacy of partition continues to shape relations between India and Pakistan to this day. How did people survive the terror of partition, and what were the long-lasting effects of this violent upheaval on the Indian subcontinent? The First and Second Sudanese Civil Wars, 1955 to 1972 and 1983 to 2005. The Sudanese Civil Wars, which claimed the lives of between 2 to 3 million people, were driven by both religious and ethnic tensions between the Muslim-dominated north and the Christian and animist populations in the south. The imposition of Islamic law by the northern government was a key factor that fueled this prolonged conflict. Francis Deng, in War of Visions, explains that the wars in Sudan were about more than just religion. They were also about competing visions of governance and identity in a post-colonial state. The violence left deep scars on Sudanese society, which still struggle with the legacy of these civil wars. How did religion become a flashpoint in the Sudanese civil wars, and how did this struggle reshape the country's identity? The Lebanese Civil War from 1975 to 1990. The Lebanese Civil War, which claimed the lives of between 120,000 to 150,000 people, was fueled by sectarian divisions between Christians, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, and the Druze. Religion played a central role as rival factions vied for control of a fragmented state. Elizabeth Picard in Lebanon, A Shattered Country, notes that the religious diversity that once characterized Lebanon became a source of violent conflict as the state collapsed. The war left Lebanon divided among sectarian lines, and its effects are still felt today. How did Lebanon's religious diversity, once seen as a strength, become a source of violence during the Civil War? So that brings us to the total death toll from religious wars. When we add up the major religious conflicts of the last 3,000 years, the total death toll is estimated to be between 90 and 130 million people. These conflicts, while devastating, were often driven by a complex mix of religious, political, and economic factors. As Karen Armstrong writes, religion has been used as a justification for war, but it's rarely been the sole cause. Political and territorial ambitions have almost always played a key role in the violence associated with religious conflicts. And that brings us to our secular regimes, a new kind of violence in the 20th century. While religious conflicts have caused immense suffering and death, the 20th century witnessed an unprecedented scale of violence that emerged from secular, atheistic ideologies. Totalitarian regimes like Stalin's Soviet Union, Mao's China, and Pol Pot's Cambodia sought to eliminate religion completely and replace it with state-controlled ideology. But this was just one part of a larger, more terrifying trend: democide, the mass killing of unarmed people by their own governments. Political scientist R.J. Rummel, who coined the term democide, estimates that between 190 and 262 million people were killed by their own governments in the 20th century alone. These killings, which included genocide, politicide, and mass murder, spanned secular, atheistic, and nationalistic regimes, all seeking to consolidate power through fear and brutality. Solzhenitsyn, a survivor of Stalin's labor camps and one of the most powerful voices to critique Soviet totalitarianism, believed that the horrors of democide were deeply tied to the abandonment of the belief in God. In his famous 1983 Templeton Address, he remarked, "Over half a century ago, while I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of older people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why this all happened. For Solzhenitsyn, the root of totalitarian violence lay in the moral vacuum created when societies reject religious principles. He saw the Soviet Union's militant atheism as more than just an attack on faith. It was an attack on the very idea of moral absolutes. Without the belief that human life is sacred, he argued, it becomes all too easy for state authorities to justify mass murder for the greater good. Soviet Union under Stalin, 1924 to 1953. Under Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union became a symbol of state terror. Stalin's purges forced collectivization, and the man-made famine in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor, led to the deaths of between 20 and 60 million people. The regime's goal was to suppress dissent, reshape society, and eliminate any threat to Stalin's power. Solzhenitsyn, who personally endured the horrors of Stalin's labor camps, believed that this violence was a natural consequence of the Soviet Union's rejection of religion. He argued that by denying God, the state also denied any higher moral authority, paving the way for unspeakable atrocities. In his words, the communist ideology in particular based its atheism on a denial of eternal moral principles which allowed for the justification of democide. As Stalin's regime unleashed its purges, political opponents, intellectuals, and even loyal party members were arrested, tortured, and executed. Thousands of priests were executed, churches were destroyed, and religious practices were outlawed. Historian Robert Conquests describes this period as a war on faith and on humanity, waged by a state that sought to eliminate all sources of moral authority other than itself. How did ordinary Soviet citizens live in constant fear of the knock on the door, knowing that they could be next? And what happens to a society when the acknowledgement of all sources of moral authority outside the state are destroyed? Maoist China, 1949 to 1976. Mao Zedong's China was responsible for the death of between 40 and 80 million people, largely through the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Mao's radical policies aimed to transform China into a communist utopia, but instead unleashed famine, violence, and chaos. Solzhenitsyn's critique of Soviet atheism can also be applied to Mao's regime, which similarly rejected religious faith in favor of state control. Mao viewed religion as a relic of the past and that it had no place in his vision for a modern communist China. In this sense, Mao's campaign to eliminate religion mirrors the broader pattern identified by Solzhenitsyn. When societies reject God, they also reject the sanctity of human life, making it easier for the state to commit atrocities. In the countryside, millions starved as Mao's agricultural policies failed disastrously. Frank Decoder writes in The Cultural Revolution, A People's History, that Mao saw religion as an obstacle to the ideological purity of his revolution. His revolution demanded total ideological purity, and anything that did not align with the state's narrative was ruthlessly destroyed. Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1945. Under Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany carried out one of the most infamous genocides in history, the Holocaust, which resulted in the deaths of 6 million Jews and was part of a larger system of state-sponsored mass murder that claimed the lives of around 17 million people, including Roma, often known as gypsies, disabled individuals, homosexuals, and political dissidents. While Nazi ideology wasn't explicitly atheist, it replaced traditional religious values with a racialist worldview, elevating the state and the Aryan race to positions of near-divine authority. This form of democide driven by the belief in the superiority of the state over the individual, exemplifies the moral decay that Solzhenitsyn warned about. As historian Timothy Snyder explains, the Holocaust was a state-driven act of democide fueled by a racialist ideology that saw certain groups as subhuman and disposable. Solzhenitsyn would have recognized in the Nazi regime the same forces at work in the Soviet Union, the replacement of religious and moral values with an ideology that justified mass murder for the sake of state power. Imperial Japan, 1931 to 1945. Imperial Japan's aggressive expansion across Asia resulted in deaths of between 3 and 10 million people. The Japanese military committed widespread atrocities, including the infamous Nanking Massacre, during which an estimated 300,000 Chinese civilians were slaughtered in a matter of weeks. Driven by a militaristic and nationalist ideology, Japan's regime became a deadly force across the Pacific. Like the other democidal regimes of the 20th century, Imperial Japan showed that when the state elevates itself above traditional religious or moral authority, it can justify mass murder on an unimaginable scale. North Korea, 1948 to the present. North Korea, under the Kim dynasty, has been responsible for the deaths of between 2 and 3 million people, largely due to famine, political purges, and labor camps. The regime has enforced a strict cult of personality around the ruling Kim family, which has replaced traditional religion. One defector from North Korea describes the absolute control of the regime. The Kims are like gods to the people. We are taught from birth to worship them, and any act of defiance means death. There is no religion but the state. The brutality of the regime is mirrored by its labor camps, where political prisoners are subjected to forced labor, starvation, and execution. Historian B.R. Myers in The Cleanest Race writes that the Kim regime in North Korea operates like a state religion, with the leaders revered as godlike figures. Christianity and other forms of religious worship are brutally suppressed, with severe punishment for those who practice their faith. North Korea is a prime example of how a state can use the suppression of religion as a tool to cement absolute power. Cambodia under Pol Pot, 1975 to 1979. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia resulted in the deaths of between 1.5 and 2 million people. Pol Pot's radical communist vision involved the complete eradication of religion, culture, and tradition. Solzhenitsyn's belief that the rejection of God leads to the erosion of moral absolutes is starkly evident in Cambodia's killing fields. The Khmer Rouge, in its quest to create a classless, atheist society, eliminated traditional sources of authority, including religious institutions. Ben Kiernan writes in the Pol Pot regime that Khmer Rouge's attempt to create a classless, atheist society resulted in one of the most brutal democides in modern history. When we broaden the scope of democide beyond these specific regimes, we see even more examples of state-sponsored violence that transcends religious or secular categories, from Stalin to Hitler, Mao to Pol Pot, and Imperial Japan to North Korea. The 20th century alone was marked by unprecedented government-perpetuated mass killings. In total, democide claimed between 190 and 262 million lives in the 20th century alone. Solzhenitsyn saw this trend as part of a broader retreat of religious consciousness in favor of atheism, scientism, and secularism. For him, the communist ideology of the 20th century was particularly dangerous because it based its atheism on a denial of eternal moral principles, allowing for the justification of democide. So now we come to death in God's name versus secular and democidal regimes. As it pertains to all the bloodiest religious wars in history, estimated death toll 90 to 130 million over 3,000 years. Now, in terms of the secular and democidal regimes, the estimated death toll 190 to 262 million people in just the last 100 years. When we compare the two, the results are staggering. Religious wars have caused immense suffering throughout history, but the deadliest regimes in history were those that sought to eliminate religion altogether, or replace it with its totalitarian ideologies. The scale of violence carried out by secular and nationalist regimes in the 20th century far exceeds that of religious conflicts over the last 3,000 years. Lessons from history. So, what can we learn from this comparison? Both religious and secular ideologies have been used to justify violence, but the deadliest regimes in history were those that sought to suppress or replace faith entirely. Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Hitler, Imperial Japan, and the Kim dynasty built their power on the elimination of the acknowledgement of any religious or moral authority, resulting in tens of millions of deaths. Solzhenitsyn believed that societies that reject religious principles inevitably drift towards nihilism and moral relativism, paving the way for atrocities like democide. As we discussed, he argued that without religious faith, human life loses sacred value, making it easier for state authorities to justify the mass murder. And his warning is clear. The 20th century was marked by a progressive retreat of religious consciousness in favor of atheism, scientism, and secularism. At the same time, religion has also been a force for peace, social justice, and charity, inspiring movements like Gandhi's fight for Indian independence and Martin Luther King's campaign for civil rights in the United States. The lesson from history is that it's not religion or secularism alone that causes violence. It's the pursuit of absolute power, whether in the name of God or the state, that leads to the greatest atrocities. If this video made you think, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. What do you think? Is religion the main cause of violence and conflict in the world? Or do secular ideologies bear more responsibility? Let's keep the conversation going. And thank you for joining us at War and Wisdom in History. Stay curious, seek wisdom, and we'll see you in the next chapter of history.